I remember the fluorescent clock in Emma Turner's ICU room, 2:17 a.m. Its green digits pulsed like a failing heartbeat, and the ventilator kept time with a slow, mechanical hiss. The attending physician leaned close to her parents and, in a hush that was almost merciful, told them she wouldn't make it through the night. Richard Turner's fingers tightened around his daughter's limp hand. Linda tried to thank the doctor, but managed only silence. In that instant, every childhood memory, dance recitals, scraped knees, 4th of July sparklers, collapsed into a single unbearable command. Say goodbye. Tonight, I will guide you through the hours that led up to that whisper, the hours that followed it, and the tiny miracle that no monitor, no chart, and no algorithm could explain. Before there were syringes, beeping pumps, and sterile corridors, there was a 4th of July barbecue behind the Turner's house. Emma, 37, an art teacher who jogged at dawn and collected rainwater in mason jars for her watercolors, spun sparklers beside her niece, giggling as fireflies blinked in the dark. 6 weeks later, a ventilator tube would replace that summer breeze. Emma called her heart a stubborn metronome. At 18, she'd been diagnosed with mild congenital arrhythmia. Twice a year, she wore a Holter monitor, mailed the results to Dr. Malik, and dutifully filed away the reassurance that everything was still within parameters. She lived like someone who believed maintenance was the same thing as safety, until Tuesday, August 14th. I'd like you to picture Emma Turner 9 weeks before the collapse, long before ICU monitors and whisper prognosis, running the annual Lakeside Half Marathon with her father. Dawn slid over Lake Michigan like liquid pewter, and 17-year-old Emma was all elbows and ponytail, nervous energy popping off her like static. The organizers pinned bib number 324 to her tank top. She joked that 324 sounded like a countdown. 3 miles of courage, 2 of doubt for stubbornness. Richard, then 48 and still carrying the easy strength of his Navy years, paced beside her at the start line. He offered the same advice he'd given since she was 5 and racing neighborhood kids for popsicles. Run the first mile like it's your warm-up. Run the last like someone you love is waiting on the finished tape. She rolled her eyes, said she loved no one enough to sprint 13 miles for them, then winked, because of course she did. Mile 1. The pack bunched tight, shoes slapping pavement in a heartbeat cadence. Emma felt invincible, lungs sipping September air that smelled of damp leaves and kettle corn from concession stands being set up for the post-race fair. Mile 4. Richard pointed the horizon where the lake met sky. A misty band of silver matched the paint Emma kept in her art kit, Payne's gray mixed with titanium white. She said she'd paint that line someday. He answered that someday was code for, "You'll forget unless you do it now." At mile 7, the course tilted upward toward Sycamore Hill. Most runners slowed. Emma sped up, her competitive spark fanning hot. She left her father 10 stride behind, arms pumping like she was brushing doubt off her shoulders. The crowd thinned. All she heard was her own breathing and the rattle of race bibs in the wind. Halfway up the incline, her pulse stuttered, a hiccup in the metronome she trusted. It happened so quickly she wondered if she'd imagine it, but the second stutter felt like a stone skipping across water in her chest. She stumbled to the roadside, hand pressed between her ribs, eyes tracking the swirl of fallen sycamore leaves. Richard caught up, asked if she'd twisted an ankle. She lied, said the hill punched the breath out of her. Nothing more. 2 deep gulps of Gatorade, a joke about hills being jealous mountains. And she started running again. She crossed the finish in 2 hours, 11 minutes. Slow by her own standards, yet the announcer called her name like gold. Richard draped the finisher's medal around her neck. Emma pretended not to notice the tremor in her hands as adrenaline ebbed. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her heart flip-flopped in her chest, while the ceiling fan carved shadows across her room. She opened her sketchbook and tried to paint the horizon line she'd promised herself, but every brushstroke looked like static. At 1 a.m., she wrote a single line under the half-finished watercolor. Even stubborn metronomes miss a beat. She never showed the painting to anyone, not even Kate. She filed it beneath other teenage experiments, convinced that naming a fear turned it into prophecy. 2 weeks later, a pediatric cardiologist confirmed the arrhythmia. 6 months after that, she wore her first Holter monitor, tape itching her collarbone while she led the high school art club's mural project. Emma joked the monitor looked like a clunky beeper, proof that her heart preferred retro tech. But here's the detail that matters. Every checkup afterward told her she was fine. Stable, within parameters. Stability, she decided, wasn't just a medical status. It was permission to dream without reservation. She ran smaller races, hiked in thunderstorms, sang karaoke so hard her pulse drummed in her throat. Yet on quiet evenings, painting alone, she sometimes pressed fingers to hollow at her neck, counting beats, making sure the stubborn metronome still kept perfect time. Fast forward to the first week of school, Jefferson Middle humming with the scent of wax floors and chalk dust. Emma stood before 30 restless seventh graders. Palette smeared crimson, cobalt, cadmium yellow. Colors she once called the traffic lights of emotion. That was the moment the hallway tilted. The sky punched her lungs, and the sparkles of July flashed behind her eyes. It was the first week of school. Jefferson Middle smelled of wax floors and chalk dust. Emma lifted a palette smeared with crimson, cobalt, and cadmium yellow, explaining complementary colors to a room of restless seventh graders. When the hallway tilted, she felt the oxygen leave her lungs, as if somebody had punched the sky. Students would later tell the principal that Ms. Turner's painting crashed to the tiles first. Then she fell beside it, colors blooming across the floor like foreshadowed tragedy. Paramedics revived her twice in the ambulance. Her sister, Kate, numb with fear, scrolled through Emma's phone for the contact labeled icy in case of emergency and whispered into the receiver that her sister was on her way to Mercy General. Cardiac arrest, they said. No one was sure why. Flash red strobe lights spilled across the art room windows as Emma's stretcher wheeled out. But once the ambulance doors slammed shut, the world outside collapsed into a tunnel of siren and steel. The interior smelled of antiseptic and hot rubber, the floor plates shuddering with every pothole like a snare drum under Kate's feet. Paramedic Morales, name stitched in fading thread, knelt beside the gurney reciting blood pressure numbers that seemed to drop faster than the exit signs on the freeway. He spoke calmly, yet every word carried the clipped cadence of someone racing a fuse. V-fib recurrent, 2 milligrams AP on board, prepping second shock. Kate pressed her back to the aluminum wall, clutching Emma's phone so tightly the edge bit her palm. The screen still showed the half-type class attendance sheet. Period 3, color theory. A drop of crimson paint, wiped from Emma's palette during the fall, had dried into a ghostly fingerprint across the glass. As the art itself refused to let go, Morales positioned the paddles. Charge clear. A crack of electricity jolted Emma's shoulders. Her body arched, then settled. The heart monitor spat a jagged green scribble that refused to coalesce into rhythm. To Kate, the blips looked like a seismograph recording an earthquake no one else could feel. Morales explained in a quick aside, never meeting Kate's eyes, that ventricular fibrillation was like a bird trapped in a cage made of ribs. Its wings beat so frantically it forgets how to fly forward. He pressed another syringe into the foreline, lidocaine this time, and urged Emma's heart to remember the pattern of motion and rest. Outside, traffic peeled away as state troopers blocked intersections. Through the rear door's windows, Kate saw an ocean of brake lights parting. Minivans, delivery trucks, a city bus with passengers craning necks to glimpse the drama none of them would ever know by name. She imagined them telling loved ones at dinner, "I hope whoever was inside made it." She wanted to shout her sister's name to each windshield, beg them to pray, to scream, to do anything that might stitch more seconds of thread unraveling in front of her. The ambulance rounded the last curve before Mercy General, siren echoing off the glass facade of an office tower. For a heartbeat, one perfect, cruel heartbeat. The reflection made it look as if two ambulances raced toward one another, mirror images converging on the same fragile hope. Morales radioed ahead. Female 37, witness arrest, 2 shocks delivered. Currently pulseless V-fib, ETA 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds unspooled like slow motion. Kate noticed a sticker above the rear bench that read "Time saves lives" in peeling blue vinyl. She wondered which genius decided to summarize medicine in 3 words, and whether they'd ever sat where she was, counting the lifetimes between monitor alarms. When the siren cut off, the sudden silence felt obscene, as if the world had muted itself out of respect for something expected to die. The back doors burst open to fluorescent daylight. A trauma team flooded in, a choreography of latex gloves snapping, questions overlapping, gurney locks clacking against asphalt. Kate tried to follow, but an orderly held her at the curb, directing her toward admitting. She caught one last glimpse of Emma's face as the stretcher pivoted. Lips mottled blue, eyelids fluttering like thin curtains caught in a storm draft. Inside the emergency department, the temperature plunged, air conditioning blasting to keep bacteria sluggish. Automatic doors inhaled her into a lobby painted the same dull mauve as every other hospital she'd ever visited, as if sorrow had a brand identity. A triage nurse handed her a clipboard of forms, but the blanks swam. She could not remember Emma's insurance number, could barely remember her own name. She whispered, "Just Turner, Emma Turner." And the nurse, softening, wrote unknown in the spaces Kate left empty. Through a square of safety glass, she watched the code team wheel Emma behind swinging double doors marked restricted. Code blue area. A digital clock above them ticked 12:47 p.m. Kate would memorize that number, replayed in dreams, because it was the last moment before knowledge replaced uncertainty, before diagnoses and percentages attempted to quantify the enormity of losing or saving a life. 30 yards away, a vending machine hummed beside a bank of payphones nobody used anymore. Kate dialed her parents on her cell instead. She tried to steady her voice, but the first sentence shattered. "Mom, Dad, it's her heart. They don't know if she'll make it." She could hear Linda's gasp explode across 300 miles of fiber optic cable. She heard Richard drop something. Maybe the TV remote, maybe his composure. When the phone call ended, Kate pressed her forehead to the cool plaster wall and forced herself to breathe in count of 8, the way Emma taught anxious students on presentation days. Each inhale tasted of bleach and recycled fear. Each exhale floated a plea into the sterile corridor. Hold on, hold on, hold on. 10 minutes later, a resident in green scrubs emerged, mask lowered, brow pinched with the reluctant authority of youth. He said they had regained a pulse, weak but present, and were moving Emma directly to the cardiac ICU for therapeutic hypothermia and advanced imaging. He spoke the words critical but stable, then hurried off, leaving Kate to parse the contradiction. Stable, she decided, was another hospital slogan. Stable is just the eye of a storm you have to keep walking through. She clutched Emma's phone, fingerprint of crimson paint glowing under the lobby lights, and followed the signs upward to the ICU, each step a bargain. One stare for one more minute of heartbeat. Unseen above her, monitors prepared to chart a war that would last the longest night of their lives. In the cardiac ICU, Dr. Malik sounded nothing like the reassuring specialist Emma remembered. He explained that multiple episodes of ventricular fibrillation had shredded whatever stability her heart once had, and that her ejection fraction was now catastrophically low. Without a transplant, days, maybe hours. Unfortunately, AB-negative donors might take weeks, months. The transplant list moved like a glacier. Emma was bleeding seconds. Richard Turner, retired engineer, tried to bargain with numbers. One compatible donor in every 2,000, an average 8-hour window for harvest and transport, a 3% chance that a heart would materialize in time. He stared at those odds the way some people stare at a crucifix. The chapel at Mercy General occupied a forgotten elbow of the second floor, wedged between nuclear medicine and a supply closet no one unlocked anymore. Linda Turner pushed through its oak door and entered a half-light that smelled of furniture polish, spent candles, and something older, like hymnals left open too long. The space was narrower than she expected. 8 short pews on each side, kneelers worn smooth where thousands of strangers had bargained with God before her. At the far wall hung a stained glass panel of Gethsemane. Christ bowed beneath a moon of cobalt and fractured scarlet. Fluorescent fixtures above washed those colors into a dull watercolor, but when Linda stepped closer the reds brightened into living ember, and she thought absurdly that the light must be siphoning itself from Emma's blood to glow like that. She chose the 4th pew. Number 4 felt honest, not too close to the altar, not so far back that it looked like doubt. When her knees touched the padded rail, they buckled, not from pain, but from the sudden weight of every prayer she'd never said. She clasped her hands, surprised at how unfamiliar the gesture felt, as if muscle memory alone refused to guide her. Somewhere beyond the wall a heart monitor beeped. its rhythm threading through the silence until it sounded like an impatient metronome trying to teach her the tempo of petition. Linda had not prayed, really prayed, since her mother's funeral 10 years earlier. That service was held in St. Bridget's downtown, a cathedral with ceiling vaults high enough to make grief echo. She remembered standing beside the closed casket, whispering a promise to call on God only when she could do so with gratitude rather than panic. She had broken that promise within a month. Each panicked plea about bills, termites, and college tuition left her more embarrassed than comforted. Eventually, she stopped altogether, certain heaven had caller ID and would see through the courtesy. Now she closed her eyes and tried to rekindle the muscle of belief. Words came slowly, rusty hinges, but they came. "Lord, it's Linda. I know it's been a while." Her voice cracked on the name Linda, as if repeating it might remind God who she was, or remind herself. She inhaled and tasted hospital oxygen, chilled, metallic. Faith sent it only because hope stood behind every breath like a ghost. She began with thanksgiving. Catechism had taught that order, but gratitude melted into apology before she finished the first sentence. "I'm sorry for the years I called coincidence what might have been your mercy. I'm sorry for letting Sundays become grocery mornings, for letting Emma believe spirituality could wait until retirement." The beeping monitor beyond the wall chirped louder, as though punctuating her confessions with telemetry. Linda opened her purse and pulled out the rosary her grandmother had given her at 15. The beads tangled around an inhaler, a stick of gum, and a miniature watercolor Emma painted of Lake Michigan last Christmas. She freed the rosary and held it to her lips. The silver crucifix felt warmer than metal should in an air-conditioned chapel. She wondered if heat conducted better through desperation. On the first bead, she recited a Hail Mary, but halfway she replaced "Pray for us sinners" with "Pray for my daughter." On the second bead, she abandoned the formal prayer entirely, telling Mary, woman to woman, that watching a child suffer feels like swallowing glass while smiling for the relatives. She threaded 3 more beads before tears blurred the crucifix into a molten smear. The stained glass moon over Gethsemane looked watery, too, as if the night garden mourned with her. A flicker of fluorescent light overhead stuttered. Linda glanced up, irrationally hungry for signs. A bulb failing might mean nothing, might mean presence. She remembered her own mother teaching her that God sometimes speaks in burnt-out filaments and cracked pavement, and the things maintenance forgets to fix. "Please," she whispered, "if you're here, let me keep her even if I never forgive myself for every time I yelled at her to hurry." Images arrived unbidden. Emma at 6 balancing on a kitchen stool to laugh at biscuit dough rising. Emma at 12 scraping her knee on the driveway and refusing help so she could own the victory of standing. Emma at 17 clutching a finisher's medal, cheeks flushed, insisting she felt fine though her pulse skittered. Each memory carried its own soundtrack, a laugh, a gasp, and each sent a new tremor through Linda's clasped hands. She struck a bargain then, plain and unvarnished. The way her grandmother once told her bargains must be because God already knows the garnish. "If you let her live, I will sit in the front pew every Sunday. I will memorize the Psalms I skipped. I will feed the hungry at St. Bridget's pantry instead of donating expired cans to ease my conscience. I will learn her medications, her transplant schedule, her sodium intake. I will not complain about the miles to Mayo or the insurance forms or the beeping machines at night. I will take every flutter of her new heart as a metronome guiding us both back to you." The overhead monitor beat grew fainter. Maybe Emma's bed wheeled farther down the hall. Maybe the chapel door muffled it. Either possibility felt like time slipping. Linda fumbled for a votive candle in the rack by the altar. Most were half-melted nubs, but one stood untouched, its glass sleeve dusty. She fed a donation into the slot, struck a match from the brass box, and touched flame to wick. It flared with impatient life, then settled into a blue-gold hush. The candle's small heat warmed her cheeks, painted the crucifix on the wall with trembling light, so it seemed Christ himself breathed. Linda bowed her head until her forehead brushed the pew's wood and stayed there long enough for the grain to carve itself into her skin. She spoke one last sentence, not a promise, not a plea, but a surrender. "Do what you must, but please don't do it without me." She meant she would not leave the chapel until someone dragged her for news. She meant if suffering was a ticket price for a miracle, she'd pay in installments of bone and marrow. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Kate's sneakers slapping vinyl. Linda lifted her head, wiped tears with the back of her hand, and watched the candle flame shimmy as if bowing to oncoming fate. She rose, knees stiff, and slipped a still-warm rosary into the pocket of her cardigan where her pulse throbbed frantic against the beads. Outside the chapel door, fluorescent light reclaimed her, and for one breath she felt as though she carried the stained-glass moon inside her chest, a secret lantern guiding her back to the labyrinth of corridors toward whatever verdict waited. 9 p.m. in the waiting room tastes like powdered coffee, vending machine pretzels, and the terrifying intimacy of strangers' grief. Kate texted updates to relatives who weren't brave enough to drive in. Linda rehearsed words no mother wants to say. "You can rest now, sweetheart." Richard wrote down everything the nurses said, as if bullet points could anchor hope. On Emma's bedside table lay a watercolor postcard she'd been working on for a class. A sunrise over Lake Michigan. The tape that held it curled in the cold air, and the edges lifted, almost breathing. At 2:15 a.m., the ICU neon buzzed like an anxious insect. Dr. Harris, the night lead, gathered the family outside the glass doors. In a voice so soft Richard would replay it in nightmares, the doctor explained they had maximized pharmacological support. Another arrest would likely leave Emma's brain without oxygen for too long. He advised calling anyone who wanted a final moment. Richard understood the subtext. Prepare instructions for a do not resuscitate. The word "she won't make it through the night" sounded heavy enough to sink a ship. Linda pressed her palm against the glass, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall beneath a sea of wires. She tried to memorize every contour of Emma's face in case memory had to substitute for presence. They came in waves. Maya, Emma's childhood friend, arrived clutching a stuffed penguin Emma once won at a county fair. Coach Ramirez from cross country whispered that the kids still quoted her mile-split mantra, "Run the last lap like the first." 12 former students tiptoed down the hallway and taped watercolor thank you notes to the ICU door, tiny prayers in indigo and teal. Inside, Richard leaned close to Emma's ear. He told her that if she was tired it was okay to rest, that he would keep her sketchbooks safe, that he forgave her for nothing because there was nothing to forgive. He felt the stubble on her scalp where the nurse had shaved a patch for leads, and he wondered how it could still be warm when the doctor said the night was colder than statistics. Behind him, Kate spoke of unfinished plans, Barcelona, Gaudi, and sunset over the Sagrada Familia. She promised Emma they would watch the stained glass windows together, that she would hold her hand the whole flight, that Emma just had to keep breathing. Linda could manage only a single line of scripture she half remembered. "Though I walk to the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The ventilator hissed like the valley's wind. Somewhere toward 3 a.m., a nurse checking vitals noticed a subtle shift. Emma's heart rate, which had been fluttering in the high 40s, steadied at 48. A trivial uptick, medically meaningless, yet nurses trust patterns, and this felt like the beginning of one. 30 minutes later, the arterial BP crept upward. A resident frowned at the screen, adjusted a vasopressor drip, but the numbers continued their gentle rebellion. By 4 a.m., the oxygen saturation, stubbornly in the 80s all night, nudged 91. Emma's eyelids flickered. It wasn't a conscious movement, more like a Morse code tapped by the soul itself. Not yet. Linda saw it first. She gasped so loudly the nurse thought something had gone wrong. Richard surged to his feet, scanning the monitors like an engineer reading a fault-tolerant system, miraculously rebooting. Kate began to cry, not the soft, polite tears of agony, but the shuddering sobs of a woman who'd just seen a stone roll away from a tomb. The night shift team documented every metric, but none could supply a reason. No donor heart had appeared. No experimental drug had been administered. All that existed was a body renegotiating its contract with mortality. At 6:30 a.m., sunlight bled through the slats of the ICU blinds, painting Emma's face gold. The ventilator still delivered breaths, but the machine now followed her rhythm instead of forcing it. The nurse adjusted settings down, a tiny gesture of hope. When Dr. Harris returned, he compared midnight labs to dawn labs 3 times before trusting his own eyes. He told the family it was highly unusual, an evasive phrase doctors use when impossible feels unscientific. Emma still needed a transplant, but the immediate cliff had receded. Linda asked if they should keep the relatives on standby for funeral arrangements. The doctor replied, almost apologetically, "I think we can cancel the mortuary call for now." Richard exhaled a laugh. So fragile, it sounded like heartbreak in reverse. He pressed his forehead to Emma's and whispered that she had always been the stubborn one. The ventilator answered with a gentle sigh. "I would love to tell you that Emma Turner's sudden stability meant she was safe, but miracles seldom arrive fully assembled." At 7 a.m., the sun lit her hospital room like a stage, and every beep of the monitor sounded like a jury deliberating the verdict. Nurses called a pink morning, an inside joke about patients who surprised the night shift by refusing to die. Emma was still intubated, her chest rising and falling beneath sky-blue sheets, yet each breath looked a little less forced. Dr. Harris used phrases like transient compensation and watchful waiting. The family clung to one phrase only: "She's still here." Hope, paradoxically, multiplies fear. Now that Emma might outlast the night, she needed a donor more than ever. Her chart moved to status 1B, second highest urgency, but AB-negative donors appeared less often than comet showers. Kate commandeered a whiteboard in the waiting room, sketching flowcharts of possible scenarios: donor within 48 hours, temporary LVAD placement, experimental trials. Richard faxed insurance paperwork at 2-hour intervals, as if bureaucracy responded to persistence. Linda reopened her long-abandoned church Facebook account and asked for prayers. Hundreds of strangers answered, their comments stacking like digital votive candles. At 11 a.m., a coordinator from UNOS called potential match in Dayton, Ohio. The donor, a 24-year-old male, brain dead after a motorcycle crash. Blood type AB negative, HLA match high. Hope surged, but logistics kill hope quickly. Whether grounded the retrieval helicopter, the donor's family needed more time, viability window shrinking. 4 or 5 hours the Turners lived between circling verbs: may, might, could. Then for 09 p.m., the call came: viability lost, heart unsuitable. Kate erased a line on her chart, markers squeaking like grief. Relapse, 7 p.m. 7 p.m. bled into the ICU like a low tide pulling hope back out to sea. The hallway lights dimmed to evening mode, monitors recalibrated for night shift vigilance, and Emma's room, room 217, settled into the hush that often precedes surrender. Then the ventilator alarm chirped a frantic staccato and yanked everyone upright. The numbers told the story first. Oxygen saturation free fell from 91 to 83, arterial pressure sagged, and the pale lines of Emma's ECG stretched into unsettling plateaus. A junior nurse silenced the alarm, but silence only made the plunging percentages louder. Dr. Malik strode in, white coat flaring like a sail, catching a storm wind. He ordered a stat echocardiogram, his voice clipped as a metronome losing count. While the cart arrived, Richard pulled a folding chair to the bedside. He spoke into Emma's ear with the tone he used when she was 5 and too scared of thunder to sleep. "July 5th, 1984, he murmured. "You arrived in the middle of the blackout. The nurses lit hurricane lamps because the generator failed. The first thing you saw was firelight, kiddo. Maybe that's why you burned so stubborn." Emma's eyelids didn't flicker, but the pulse oximeter grappled with each beat as if deciding whether to believe in it. The echo, a resident gelled the probe and pressed it against Emma's sternum. The screen blossomed with grayscale ventricles, 2 ghostly wings trying to remember flight. Malik narrated for the record, but really for the family. Severely dilated left ventricle, regurgitant jet to the mitral valve, a wall motion that fluttered like an umbrella blown inside out. Richard watched, mind elsewhere. He saw that July thunderstorm again, how each lightning flash made the maternity ward glow. He remembered thinking storms were angry until Emma arrived and proved they could also be celebrations. Kate's bargain. Across the room, Kate whispered new bargains into clasped hands. "If the numbers climb again, I'll donate my vacation time. I'll learn to cook low sodium. I'll paint every wall in her house the color of sunrise." She eyed the whiteboard she'd filled with plans A through E and added Plan F. Emergency MO. The letters shaky, markers squealing like fear on glass. Linda's psalm. Linda slid a Gideon Bible from the bedside drawer, its pages thin as breath, and read Psalm 46 aloud. The words, "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way," floated over the smell of disinfectant, over the hiss of oxygen, over the low drone of the echo machine. She didn't realize she was weeping until the psalm blurred. Malik handed her a tissue without looking away from the screen. Intervention. The echo ended. Orders flew. Up-to-trait vasopressors. Increase peep draw lactate. Cross-match more blood. A respiratory therapist adjusted settings. The ventilator now forcing air like bellows in a dying forge. Emma's chest rose and fell in jerks. Each rise a question. Each fall a partial answer. Richard pressed his forehead to hers. "If this is goodbye again," he whispered, "then remember the first hello. You were purple and furious, but the second you heard my voice you quieted. Quiet now, kiddo, if you must, but come back angry. Anger means you're here." A flicker minute stretched. 8, 9, 15. Then, like a ripple across still water, the pulse oximeter ticked 84, 86. Nurses exchanged glances, unsure whether to trust optimism this late in the shift. By 8 o'clock, saturation touched 89. Dr. Malik's shoulders dropped a centimeter. He ordered the vasopressor tapered. The ventilator alarm silenced itself, settling into a softer rhythm that sounded almost like Emma's breathing was setting the pace again. Richard exhaled, a sound half-laugh, half-sob. He kissed Emma's temple and told her the storm wasn't over, but the eye had passed. Linda closed the Bible. Kate erased ICMO from Plan F and rewrote it smaller, like a threat relegated a footnote. Outside the ICU windows, sunset smeared the skyline with bruised oranges and purples. Colors Emma once mixed to teach children how complementary tones can create harmony after chaos. Inside room 217, those same hues reflected off monitor glass, painting the wavering line of her heartbeat in borrowed twilight. The relapse did not end the war, but it reminded everyone that Emma's body still knew how to negotiate with death, and for the moment was winning another round. Around 10 p.m., a nurse named Sloan, shift nearly done, noticed Emma's arterial line trending ever lower. Sloan had seen 3 patients die that month and hated the look of surrender in family eyes. She brewed strong coffee and made an unauthorized decision. She would stay past her shift until Emma was either stable or gone. Sloan sat at Emma's bedside reading her old lab notebooks. Pages of paint color mixes, notes for lesson plans, funny doodles. She spoke to Emma as if chatting after class, describing each paint swatch's name: alizarin crimson, Payne's gray, Naples yellow. She said artists live by color, and color lives by light, and morning would bring light if Emma wanted to see it. 2:03 a.m. Almost exactly 24 hours after the doctor's whisper, the heart rate monitor performed a slow, deliberate climb. 46, 50, 54 BPM. Nurses reran labs, lactate clearing, potassium balancing without intervention. The arterial pressure, like a stubborn knot, loosened. Sloan scribbled vitals and paged Dr. Harris. He arrived sleepy, bewildered, and whispered the most honest sentence medicine allows: "I don't know what's happening, but don't stop it." At 3 a.m., Emma's eyelids lifted, just a millimeter, but eyes slack with sedation rarely rise. Sloan leaned close. Emma's gaze fluttered toward the ceiling lights and then fixed on Sloan's badge. The ventilator sensed that subtle effort and switched to spontaneous assist mode. Emma drew her own breath, thin, shaky hers. Sloan pressed the call button and told the unit, "She's breathing." Richard burst through the doorway. His mouth formed questions but produced only a guttural laugh cry. Linda crossed herself so quickly she nearly fainted. Kate whispered, "Barcelona." Emma's heart rate ticked up as if in reply. For 17 a.m., another phone rang. One the family had forgotten could bring good news. "Uno's again. We have a viable AB-negative donor heart in Minneapolis." Weather was clear. The donor hospital could harvest by 5 a.m. Charter jet wheels up by 5:45. Estimated arrival Mercy General 710. Viability window perfect. Dr. Malik raised consent forms to Richard and Linda. Signatures blurred behind tears. Emma, drifting in and out, squeezed Kate's finger. slow, deliberate. Nurses called it purposeful movement. Surgery, a layman's glimpse behind the doors, is almost equal to 4000 plus characters. The operating suite they rolled Emma into was kept at a deliberate 61 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to make surgeons alert and bacteria sluggish. Richard glimpsed the room for 3 seconds before the double doors sealed, but those 3 seconds etched themselves into his memory like a photograph developed in ice. Brushed steel cabinets full of suture packs, overhead booms dangling LED so bright they cast no shadow, and a narrow stainless table upon which rested a stainless basin the size of a salad bowl, waiting for a heart that had traveled 600 miles at 5,000 feet. Outside, he clutched the blue page of the transplant coordinator had given him. Inside, time obeyed different laws. A wall clock above the scrub sink counted forward, but everyone behaved as if it were rewinding, racing to steal minutes back from entropy. The circulating nurse, Gloria, 50-something, reading glasses tethered by a pink chain, called out instrument counts like a small-town auctioneer. Scalpel 10, Blade 1, Mets 10, Rat 2-2. Her words formed the overture of a symphony Emma would never hear, yet would always carry in her chest. Dr. Kasparian, chief cardiothoracic, arrived last, sliding a playlist into a speaker the size of a coffee mug. He tapped play, a slow cello piece by Yo-Yo Ma poured into the tiled hush. Some surgeons blast classic rock. Kasparian preferred adagios, music that breathes, he once said. So my patient remembers how... Emma's body, already covered by sterile drapes, seemed tiny beneath the architecture of machines. An anesthesia tower humming propofol. An LCD that mapped her brainwave depth like starlight on water, and beside that the heart-lung machine, a cobalt-blue colossus whose tubing loops glowed with prime fluid, waiting to become blood's understudy. Perfusionist Diaz checked flow rates, her gloved fingers dancing over roller pumps with the tenderness of someone winding a music box. At 7:29, Kasparian announced, knife to skin. The scalpel opened a sternotomy line from jugular notch to xiphoid. The cut was neither hurried nor hesitant, simply inevitable. Bone saw followed, its high whine swallowed by suction and cello. Richard, seated 2 corridors away, heard none of it, only the pager pulse in his palm, steady cold. He imagined or like a spacecraft, life supported only by circuits and discipline, the surgeon its captain guiding a fragile hull through vacuum. Once the sternal halves parted, anesthesiologist Huang tilted the table head down 5 degrees, Trendelenburg, so the heart sat higher and offering. Diaz initiated systemic heparin. Coagulation time spiraled until Emma's blood behaved less like liquid, more like promise. Cannulas the width of markers slid into aorta and right atrium. Clamps hissed shut. Huang announced on bypass. Emma's heart no longer pumped, her lungs no longer oxygenated. A machine the size of a laundromat cart did both, quietly, perfectly, indifferent to miracle or tragedy. The old heart, Kasparian observed, was paper-thin and stubborn. It shivered with coarse fibrillation, even under potassium-rich cardioplegia, a moth still battering a porch-light seconds before winter. He encircled the veni cava, divided the great vessels, and lifted the organ into Gloria's cupped hands. She deposited it into the stainless basin, warm but rapidly cooling, and covered it with gauze soaked in preservation solution. For 3 blinks, Emma had no heart at all, only a cavity echoing with suction and possibility. The literal hollow everyone uses as metaphor for sorrow. The donor heart arrived in a red-lidded cooler, escorted by transplant fellow Alvarez, who'd flown jump seat on the charter jet, cradling container like a sacred relic. Inside, the heart floated in ICUW solution, fiber slack, color muted, a rose under frost. When the lid popped, Kasparian murmured, "Good turgor, no contusions, the closest thing to admiration a heart may ever hear." Reconstruction began. One by one, vessels found their counterparts. Vena cava to vena cava, pulmonary veins to left atrium, aorta to aorta. Each suture tied was a bridge from one life to another, ADOT proline weaving fates together thinner than a human eyelash. Richard's pager buzzed at 8:36. Donor heart ion warming. His breath caught. Linda squeezed his knee so hard pain grounded him to the chair. At 8:57, Diaz called out, 37 degrees, potassium washout complete. Huang reduced bypass flow. The new heart, pinking under tepid blood, twitched once like a child startled from sleep. Pacer wires ready, Gloria sang. Kasparian touched paddles. 20 joules, and now. The myocardium jerked, then settled into sinus. 62 beats per minute, each beat rediscovering physics. Systole, diastole, wonder. Pager vibrated. 9:04, new heart beating. Richard read it aloud. Kate exhaled something between a laugh and a prayer. Linda covered her mouth, eyes wide with combustible hope. Back inside, bypass tapered. Cannulas removed. Protamine reversed the heparin haze. Hemostasis checked. Wires closed the sternum. Silver laces on a treasure chest. Gloria recounted instruments. Every clamp and sponge accounted for, as though forgetting one could ransom the miracle. Huang switched Emma's ventilator settings to gentle breaths, whispering, "Let her lungs remember." As the drapes came down, Kasparian paused, fingertips resting on the fresh dressing, feeling the thump under gauze the way a geologist feels tectonic promise. "All right, Miss Turner," he said softly, though she couldn't hear. "I've done my part. Now you show me yours." They wheeled her toward the post-op ICU. Cello still played, but lower, like a benediction receding down a stone corridor. The operating light clicked off. The room exhaled, and for a heartbeat, one perfect, quiet heartbeat, the stainless basin holding the old heart seemed to pulse in sympathy, as if saying goodbye to the body that once believed it was irreplaceable. Outside, the double doors burst open. Richard, Linda, and Kate rose. The team rolled past, a procession of scrubs and soft orders. Watch the line. Secure the vent. Richard caught sight of the monitor atop the rolling bed. HR 62, BP 98 60 seconds, SPO 297%. Metrics he didn't fully grasp but loved instantly, the way parents love the first ultrasound heartbeat of a child not yet born. When the entourage vanished into post-op, the hall regained its ordinary hum. Ice machine, distant pager, fluorescent flicker. Richard slumped onto the waiting room couch, pager resting on his knee like a medal. He looked at the time, 9:17, and realized 2 hours ago his daughter's chest had been an empty room. Now it housed an instrument tuned to a new key, playing the first tentative notes of a symphony nobody had dared program. And somewhere, perhaps 50 miles above the clouds, the charter jet banked back toward Minneapolis, carrying an empty cooler and the silent of family who said yes while breaking apart. Richard vowed to track them down one day, to send a letter starting with "Your son lives" in every sunrise Emma paints now. He didn't yet know the words, but he knew the rhythm, because rhythm was beating, steady and impossible on the other side of those ICU doors. Richard read the words aloud. Linda collapsed, half laughing, half sobbing. Kate sank to the floor whispering a single Spanish word, "Milagro." Post-op ICU is quieter than pre-op. Hope softens noise. Emma lay beneath warm blankets, extubated, oxygen by nasal cannula only. Her skin pinked, nails blushed, monitors hummed like contented crickets. At noon, she opened her eyes fully. They focused on Richard. In a voice cracked by tube, she rasped, "Hey, Dad, did I miss your barbecue?" Richard laughed so hard alarms thought he was in distress. Nurses silenced him with grins. Rehabilitation and the 5K that changed everything is almost equal to 4 300 characters / voz única. The first 72 hours after transplant are a choreography of vigilance. Nurses charting urine output in milliliters. Respiratory therapists coaxing lungs to remember inhale, hold, exhale. Surgeons palpating the new heart through sterile dressings, as if listening with their fingertips. But once Emma cleared the danger zone of graft rejection and arrhythmia storms, the marathon of recovery truly began, and marathons, she would later quip, were won in centimeters, not kilometers. Day 4 of the vertical inch. A physiotherapist named Jordan wheeled an pulse ox on a stick and a tilt table that looked more medieval than medical. Emma still wore 3 chest tubes, and 4 trees sprouted lines like winter branches, and her sternum felt glued together with lightning. Jordan's goal was simple: bring her from supine to 90 degrees without her blood pressure collapsing. It took 27 minutes, 3 pauses, and 4 muttered curses Emma would deny under oath, But she stood a vertical inch from death's door, breathing shallow, tears hot. Jordan snapped a photo on Emma's phone, so she would remember this inch on darker days. Day 8, the 14 steps. Chest tubes out, pacing wires trimmed. Emma shuffled the length of the step-down corridor, gripping a wheeled walker that squeaked with every heartbeat. Kate stuck sticky notes on the walls. You've passed the left atrium. Aorta ahead. Turning the hallway into an anatomical funhouse. 14 steps out, 14 back. Her pulse jumped to 118. Sweat soaked her hospital gown, and the smell of chlorhexidine clung to her like melted plastic. But those 28 shuffled steps felt more radical than any brushstroke she'd ever laid on canvas. Week 3. The stairs and the sketchbook. Released to a rehab ward, Emma faced 6 concrete stairs that led to the parking garden. Concrete sounds benign until each riser feels like a confession of weakness. On attempt 1, she collapsed onto the 3rd step, breath ricocheting. On attempt 2, she reached the top, but sobbed so hard nurses feared she'd rupture the sternotomy wires. On attempt 5, she climbed them, sat on a wooden bench scented by marigolds, and opened a sketchbook Jordan smuggled from her classroom. Her first post-op drawing was not a sunrise, but the ECG tracing of her new heart, rendered in pencil so soft it smudged like charcoal. She titled it Borrowed Thunder. Month 2, the treadmill baptism. Cardiac rehab moved to an outpatient gym lined with mirrors. Emma hated mirrors. They showed her hair half-grown, scar ridge peeking from the neckline of a loose T-shirt and a puffy steroid moon face. Mark, the exercise physiologist, clipped telemetry wires to her chest and set the treadmill at 1.2 miles per hour. The belt chugged like a river of molasses. 10 minutes felt like drowning upright, but telemetry painted a miracle. Heart rate rose smoothly. Blood pressure held. Oxygen saturation never dipped. Mark printed a strip, framed it in dollar store acrylic, and captioned it Proof of Life. She taped it next to Borrowed Thunder. 6 months, the river loop. Winter receded. The Chicago River thawed. Emma convinced Kate to walk the 3-kilometer river loop with her. No telemetry, no nurses, just a pulse ox in Kate's purse, in case. They stopped every 4 benches. Duckling stitched V's across the water. Emma counted them aloud like brushstrokes. 1, 2, 3, because she'd promised Richard she would practice talking while exerting. She made it back to the car with lips blue-tinted but spirit incandescent. That night she painted the river in ultramarine and cadmium yellow. The reflection of skyscrapers looked like ECG spikes. 11 months, the registration form. A flyer appeared in cardiac rehab. Mercy Heartbeat 5K charity run walk. The design showed cartoon hearts wearing sneakers. Silly, but Emma couldn't ignore the coincidence. The race benefited transplant research, and the bib numbers for survivors began at number 200. She requested number 217, the number of her ICU room, and the minute her prognosis turned fatal. The race director emailed back a single line. Reserved for you, warrior. Training was humble. Intervals of 60-second jogs stitched into 4-minute walks. Heart rate kept below 140. Beta blocker timing orchestrated like rocket launches. Richard biked beside her, shouting splits. Linda followed in the minivan with glucose tabs, holy water, and 3 different playlists labeled Motivate, Distract, and Miracle. Emma hated the minivan until the day she needed the glucose tabs and the Distract track. Aretha Franklin belting respect at decibel levels high enough to shame fear. Race day, 12 months and 2 weeks post-op. The start line wound around the hospital campus. Banners fluttered. Volunteers pinned bibs, and a brass band version of Eye of the Tiger battled tinny PA announcements. Emma's heart thudded not from exertion, but from the impossible fact of presence. She stood where medevac helicopters usually landed. She adjusted her chest strap monitor and discovered Kate had printed Borrowed Thunder on the front of their matching shirts. A nurse recognized her. You're the 24-hour girl, right? And Emma laughed for the first time without guarding her sternum. The starting horn blared. She ran the first kilometer too fast, lungs flaring ice, legs heavy with prednisone weight. Richard called out split times that sounded suspiciously slower each minute. He was lying to give her courage, she realized, and the lie tasted sweeter than electrolytes. At kilometer 3, She passed the ICU windows. Staff lined the sidewalk in scrubs, waving clipboards like victory flags. Dr. Malik held up a sign. Stat orders. Finish strong. Emma's new heart pounded at 153. Right at the ceiling Mark had warned her not to cross, but she thought rules could bend for anniversaries. The final 200 meters curved beneath maples turning ember red. Each leaf looked like a tiny ventricle on fire. Emma heard nothing. The crowd muted, Richard's cheers distant, except the double drum inside her ribs, foreign yet hers. She crossed the line in 32 minutes 12 seconds. Volunteers draped a metal shaped like an anatomically correct heart over her shoulders. She fingered its edges, cool metal mirroring once cold steel scalpels, and whispered, "Thank you for the loan." In the shade of the finished arch, Emma folded forward, palms on knees, not from exhaustion but reverence. Tears streaked sunblock, mingling with salt and disbelief. Kate snapped a photo where Emma's bib number 217 glowed against a black T-shirt, proof that an ICU room number can transform into a victory chant. That evening, back at the Turner house, Emma taped the race medal beside Borrowed Thunder and the framed telemetry strip. 3 artifacts: the beat before death, the beat preserved in ink, and the beat that carried her over a finish line. She stood back, arms crossed, and for the first time in a year allowed silence to settle without checking her pulse. Later she told Richard that running 3 miles felt shorter than walking the 10 steps to the ICU window on transplant morning. He nodded, then asked what was next. Emma smiled, a smile wide enough to fit another horizon, and said she was thinking about the Lakeside Half Marathon again. Only this time, she didn't need a metaphor about 324. She had a new countdown. 1 heart, 2 races, 7 letters that spelled out the only result that mattered: survival. I asked Emma how she explains what happened. She shrugged, smiled, and said, "Tell people death bluffed, and I called." So remember that night at 2:17 a.m. when a doctor whispered an ending? It became a prologue. Emma Turner breathed again, not because medicine willed it, or numbers favored it, or prayers coerced it. She breathed because life sometimes refuses to keep silent. And if you ever find yourself in a room where goodbye feels inevitable, think of Emma, the woman whose heart stopped listening to its own prognosis, the artist who rewrote her palette with the color of impossible mornings. Because of her story, and maybe in yours, death didn't win.